All right. So much going on with Ukraine right now, and with the U.S. election wrapping up, everyone's wondering what's next for the war. We've been digging into this CNN article from November 8th, 2024, and it reveals a pretty big policy shift could have some huge consequences. Big news. The Biden administration is now letting U.S. military contractors into Ukraine, first time since the war began. The article says it's all about getting vital weapons repaired faster, things like X-16s and Patriot missile systems. Those are absolutely critical for Ukraine to defend itself. But here's the thing. This all comes right as we're about to get a new president. And Trump's talked about ending this war fast. So big question, how long will this even last? To help us break it all down, we've got our expert here. So stepping back from the day-to-day news, what's the real significance of this change?
Well, I think what's really striking is how this changes the whole U.S. approach. The article mentions a de facto ban, basically an unspoken rule before this. Damaged U.S. equipment had to be shipped out of Ukraine for repairs. Logistical nightmare takes forever and leaves Ukraine vulnerable.
Yeah, the article specifically calls out those F-16s and Patriot systems. Those are high-tech weapons, not like you can just patch them up in some field workshop.
Exactly. So having contractors right there in Ukraine means repairs happen way faster. That could be a real game changer on the battlefield, gives Ukraine a big advantage. But it goes beyond just the practical stuff. It's a sign of deeper U.S. commitment, a willingness to take on more risk to help Ukraine. And that sends a message to everyone about where America stands.
Now, speaking of risk, the article mentions needing robust risk mitigation plans for these contractors. But this is an active war zone we're talking about. What does that even look like in reality?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The article doesn't spill it out, but you got to think. Will they be armed? Will they be embedded with Ukrainian troops or have private security? And the big one, what if Russia just decides to target them directly? Huge potential for things to go really bad.
And then you've got this whole presidential transition looming over everything. Trump wants this war over and quickly. Could this whole contractor policy be gone before it even really starts?
Definitely a possibility. The article hints at that uncertainty. We're in wait-and-see mode right now. But one thing's for sure, how this all plays out will tell us a lot about the new administration, what their priorities are in the region.
Okay, and to make things even more complicated, the article points out there are already U.S. companies operating in Ukraine right now, things like logistics, humanitarian aid. So how is this different? Are we just blurring a line that was already blurry?
That's a really sharp observation, and it goes right to the core of the difference between civilian contractors and military ones. The companies that are already there, they're providing support services. They're not directly part of the fighting. But maintaining and repairing weapons, that's totally tied to combat operations. Raises the stakes dramatically. Brings up some serious ethical questions about the role of private companies in war in general.
Okay, so let's connect the dots for everyone listening. Big policy shift. U.S. military contractors allowed in Ukraine for the first time ever.
Which means faster repairs for crucial weapons. Potential advantage for Ukraine, and a signal that the U.S. is stepping up its commitment, even with all the risks that come with that.
But also big concerns about the situation getting even worse. The safety of Americans on the ground, and whether any of this will even last under a new administration.
Exactly. And got to remember, this is just one piece of a really complicated puzzle. The situation's changing constantly, so staying informed is crucial. It's not just about the headlines, it's about understanding what's underneath them.
It really makes you wonder what conversations were going on behind the scenes before this policy changed. Was this the Pentagon pushing for it? Was there pushback from other parts of the government?
You know, unfortunately, the article doesn't really say much about the decision-making process, but it's safe to say there were probably a lot of different opinions. The military probably saw this as essential to keep those advanced weapons working. On the other hand, you've got diplomats, national security experts who are probably worried about what happens if things escalate even further.
Yeah, that's the big fear, right? Escalation. What happens if Russia decides to go after these contractors? Or worse, what if one of them is captured or killed?
Nightmare scenario, but one that policymakers absolutely have to consider. The article mentions robust risk mitigation plans, but even the best plans can go wrong in a war zone. And if something does happen to American contractors, the fallout could be huge. It could force the U.S. to get involved more directly, which is exactly what Biden's been trying to avoid this whole time.
It feels like this is opening up a whole new can of worms. And with all the uncertainty around the new administration, who knows what the consequences might be?
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already super complicated situation. And it shows how important clear communication and a good strategy are going forward. The new president is going to inherit a ton of challenges, and this contractor issue is definitely right up there on the list.
For most Americans, though, this probably feels pretty far removed from their lives. But as you said, the potential consequences are huge, so why should the average person care about this? What's the takeaway?
Well, first of all, it reminds us that the war in Ukraine isn't just some far-off conflict. It can affect all of us in different ways, whether it's through the economy, the threat of a wider war, or even just the erosion of international norms and stability.
It's easy to get caught up in our own problems here and forget about these big global events happening.
Exactly. And this contractor decision is a perfect example of how those events can suddenly become very real. A wake-up call to pay attention, stay informed, and talk about America's role in the world.
So even if this seems like a minor policy detail, it's actually a window into much bigger questions about U.S. foreign policy, how wars are changing the balance of power in a very unstable world.
Precisely. And those are questions we should all care about no matter our political views or opinions. The stakes are too high to ignore.
This brings up something I've been thinking about. The article doesn't mention it directly, but doesn't this also raise some big ethical questions? I mean, we're talking about private companies making money from war.
Absolutely a crucial point. This whole reliance on military contractors in conflicts has been a growing concern for years. Questions of accountability, transparency, and the possibility that these companies might prioritize profit over peace.
Not to mention the potential for human rights abuses or even war crimes committed by contractors who might not face the same level of oversight as regular soldiers.
Exactly, and the legal framework around contractors in war zones is still very murky. It's a gray area that needs a lot more attention and debate.
It feels like we're stepping into uncharted territory. We saw what happened with contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are we just making the same mistakes all over again?
It's a very valid concern. We need to learn from the past and make sure that any use of military contractors is carefully thought out, tightly regulated, and subject to strong oversight.
So for our listeners, this isn't just about some technical policy change in Ukraine. It's about understanding the bigger picture of using private military companies in war, the ethical considerations, and the potential for unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's a conversation we need to be having, especially as the lines between traditional warfare and private military involvement continue to blur.
It really makes you think about how war is changing, doesn't it? We're not talking about massive troop deployments anymore. It's more like a shadow war with contractors playing a bigger and bigger role.
That's a trend we've been seeing in recent conflicts, from Iraq and Afghanistan to now Ukraine. The lines between traditional military and private contractors are definitely getting blurry, and that brings up a lot of ethical and legal questions that we haven't really figured out how to answer yet.
Yeah, like who's ultimately responsible for these contractors? What if they commit war crimes? How much oversight is there, really?
A bit of a Wild West out there. And policymakers and international organizations are scrambling to catch up. We need to figure out who's calling the shots and how to hold people accountable in this new landscape.
It feels like we need a whole new set of rules for this new kind of warfare. But until then, we're stuck in this uneasy gray area.
And that gray area is only going to get bigger and more complex as technology keeps advancing. Think about AI drones, cyber warfare. It's a whole new battlefield out there. And the role of contractors in that space is still a huge unknown.
So if I'm listening to this right now, the takeaway is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about a much bigger shift in how wars are being fought, and the U.S. is right in the middle of it.
Absolutely. And it raises some fundamental questions about democracy and accountability. When you have private companies wielding this much power in war zones, what does that mean for civilian control of the military? What does it mean for transparency and oversight? These are things we need to be thinking about very carefully.
It's a lot to process, but that's what makes these deep dives so important. We need to have these conversations, ask these tough questions, and try to understand what all this means. This article has been like pulling on a thread and realizing it's connected to this whole tapestry. We're only just starting to see it.
I agree. The more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these challenges and make good decisions about the future we want.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But as always, the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, seek out different viewpoints, and form your own conclusions. This is a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's something we all need to be engaged in.
Remember, knowledge is a journey, not a destination. We're all in this together.
Perfectly put. So until next time, Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. It really makes you wonder what conversations were going on behind the scenes before this policy changed. Was this the Pentagon pushing for it? Was there pushback from other parts of the government?
The article doesn't really dive into the decision-making process. But you got to figure there were probably a lot of different opinions floating around. The military side probably saw this as absolutely essential, to keep those advanced weapons systems working. But then on the other hand, you've got diplomats and national security folks probably pretty worried about things escalating even further.
And that's the big fear, right? Escalation. What if Russia decides to target these contractors directly? Or even worse, what if one of them is captured or killed?
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario, but it's one of those policymakers got to think about. The article mentions those robust risk mitigation plans. But even the best plans, things can go south real quick in a war zone. And the fallout from something like that happening to American contractors could be massive, could force the U.S. to get directly involved, which is exactly what Biden's been trying to avoid this whole time.
Feels like we're opening up a whole new can of worms here. And with the new administration coming in and all that uncertainty, who knows what could happen?
Definitely adds another layer of complexity on top of an already crazy complicated situation. And it really highlights how important clear communication and a solid strategy are going forward. The new president's going to have a lot on their plate. This contractor issue is right up there at the top of the list.
For most people here in the U.S., though, this all probably feels pretty far away. But like you said, the potential consequences are huge. So why should the average person care about this? What's the takeaway for them?
I think first and foremost, it's a reminder that this war in Ukraine isn't just some far-off thing. It has the potential to impact all of us in ways we might not even realize. The economy, the threat of a wider war, even just the erosion of those international norms and stability we rely on.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in our own lives and forget about these big global events until they come knocking on our door.
Exactly. This contractor decision is a great example of how those global events can suddenly become very real very quickly. It's a wake-up call to pay attention, stay informed, and have those tough conversations about America's place in the world.
So even though this might seem like a small policy change, it's really a window into some much bigger questions about U.S. foreign policy, about how wars are changing, about the balance of power in a world that feels increasingly unstable.
Exactly. And those are questions that we should all be asking ourselves, regardless of where we fall in the political spectrum. The stakes are too high to just ignore it.
This brings up something else I've been thinking about. The article doesn't really get into it, but doesn't this move raise some ethical red flags? Are we okay with private companies essentially profiting from war?
Yeah, that's a huge point. This whole increasing reliance on military contractors in conflict zones has been a concern for years. It raises questions about accountability, transparency, the potential for these companies to put profit before peace.
Not to mention the possibility of human rights abuses, even war crimes, committed by contractors who aren't necessarily subject to the same level of oversight as regular soldiers.
Exactly. And the whole legal framework around using contractors in war zones is still pretty murky. It's a gray area that needs a lot more attention and serious debate.
It feels like we're wading into some uncharted territory here. We saw what happened with unchecked contractor involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are we making those same mistakes again?
That's a legitimate concern. We need to learn from what happened in the past and make sure that any use of military contractors is carefully considered, tightly regulated, and subject to really strong oversight.
So for our listeners out there, this isn't just about some technical policy change in Ukraine. It's about understanding the broader implications of using private military companies in war, the ethical questions that raises, and the potential for unintended consequences that could come back to bite us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's complicated. There's no easy answers.
Yeah.
But it's a conversation we need to keep having, especially as those lines between traditional warfare and private military involvement get more and more blurred.
It really makes you think about how war is changing, doesn't it? It's not about massive troop deployments anymore. It's more like we're in this shadow war, and contractors are playing a bigger and bigger part.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that trend in recent conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Those lines between traditional military and private contractors are getting blurrier all the time. And that brings up a lot of really tough ethical and legal questions we haven't really figured out how to answer yet.
Exactly. Like, who is really responsible for these contractors? What happens if they commit war crimes? Is there even any real oversight?
It's kind of a Wild West situation out there. Policymakers, international organizations, everyone's trying to catch up. We need to figure out who's really in control and how to hold people accountable in this new world.
It It feels like we need a whole new set of rules for this new kind of war. But until then, we're just kind of stuck in this gray area.
And that gray area is only going to get bigger and more complicated as technology keeps developing. Think about AI drones, cyber warfare. It's a whole new battlefield with a whole new set of challenges. And the role of contractors in that space is a total wild card.
So the takeaway here is that this is about way more than just Ukraine. It's about a fundamental shift in how wars are being fought. And the U.S. is right in the thick of it.
Absolutely. And it raises some big questions about democracy and accountability, too. When you've got private companies with this much power in war zones, what does that mean for civilian control of the military? What about transparency and oversight? These are things we all need to be thinking about very carefully.
It's a lot to take in. But that's what these deep dives are all about, right? We need to be having these conversations, asking the tough questions, trying to understand the big picture. Reading this article was like pulling on a loose thread, and suddenly you realize it's connected to this whole tapestry, one that we're only just beginning to see.
I couldn't agree more. The more we know, the better prepared we'll be to deal with these challenges and to create the kind of future we want.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But as always, the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep digging into this topic, seek out different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's one that we all need to be engaged with.
Remember, folks, knowledge is a journey, not a destination. We're all in this together.
Perfectly put. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.